Okay. Welcome everybody to the Lost Lafayette to Lost Lafayette, an author talk with Doug Connerow. This is an event, a program hosted by the Louisville Historical Museum and the Lafayette Miners Museum. I'm Jason Hogstead. I'm a staff member with the museum in Louisville. Tonight, I'm joined by author Doug Connerow, Krista Berry of the Lafayette Miners Museum, and my colleague, Kaylin Mercury Flowers. Our program is going to be about an hour tonight, and we're going to begin in just a minute. But I wanted to just kind of let people know about how the logistics are going to work. If during the talk you think of a question, we ask that you kind of hold on to it. We're going to have a Q&A at the end where you'll either be able to type in your question or where we will unmute you so that you can verbally ask it of Doug. And you'll be able to use the hand raise function in Zoom to indicate that you would like to be unmuted and to ask your question. So that's kind of how things are going to work. And without further delay, I'm going to pass it off to Krista Berry.
Hi, I'm Krista Berry. As Jason said, I'm the director over at the Lafayette Miners Museum, and I'm happy to be here and to be a part of this talk here tonight. I have the pleasure of introducing the author, Doug Connerow. So Doug Connerow is a fourth-generation Coloradan from Louisville. He and his wife, Dana Caulfield, moved to Lafayette in 1995. Doug's family owned and operated the Louisville Times, Lafayette News, and Erie Review from 1965 to 1997. Doug has served on the Lafayette Historic Preservation Board and is past president and board member of Historic Boulder. He joined the Lafayette Historical Society in about 1998. He has a journalism degree and an MBA from the University of Colorado and worked for the family newspapers before joining the Denver Post and then the Tacoma News Tribune. He owned and published the North 40 News from 2011 to 2017. His recent book, Lost Lafayette, Colorado, is published by History Press and is an updated version of his indispensable, in my opinion, coffee table book, 80026, An Illustrated History of Lafayette, Colorado, which he self-published in 2017. And so if no further ado, I will turn it over to Doug.
Thanks, Krista. Appreciate it.
Thank
you. Welcome, everybody. So let me get this on full screen here. So just for everybody can indulge my PDF version of the slideshow here. I like being able to use it because I can use my pointer thingy and hand thingy to show things on maps. So I appreciate everybody for showing up. We were talking before this of how it's kind of nice to be able to have collaborative things and to have residents of Louisville and Lafayette together in a virtual place, and hopefully we can get together again in person. So the Lost Lafayette is I have to give you the insight about the title. The publisher wanted something a little sexier than 80026, so we agreed on Lost Lafayette, Colorado, and so that it's not confused with Lafayette, Indiana. Colorado is in it as well too, but my talk is largely on what is in common between both Louisville and Lafayette historically, but also what is unique to Lafayette, and specifically concentrating on town founder Mary Miller and her war on alcohol. So in common with both places, and this is a chapter in the book, are the indigenous peoples, and I really went out of my way to try to spend time documenting who was here and where they lived, and largely Arapaho tribes, and later the Southern Ute tribes, and obviously really into about 1869, after 1869, there was really no trace in Boulder County particularly. And the settlers even acknowledged the importance of the Native Americans in pathfinding and finding ways to navigate. And the Cherokee Trail is an example of that in Lafayette, but also the paths that are adjacent to almost every stream that were adjacent. And that's how people navigated back then, even the settlers. The stagecoach was unique to Lafayette. It followed the Cherokee Trail, which roughly is Highway 287 now. It was a major undertaking and a deal for this region. It carried the stagecoach, the Overland Express Mail, carried mail from Kansas to Salt Lake City. It was the link before the railroad came along. And this particular image is of a stagecoach that likely came through Lafayette in about 1867. This is outside of Salt Lake City. And it was an important thing for the region because it helped bring people who could document what was here, the people that were here, our geography some of it that no longer exists, and it helped pave the way for the railroad, particularly. Coal mining, of course, is in common with both communities. In Louisville was much earlier, the 1870s, of course, but coal mining really got established in Lafayette in 1888, 1887 and 1888. And the last mine closed in Lafayette proper in 1946. And the point of things that are lost and documenting things that are lost, this is one of those, that there's almost no trace of mining in either community. There are some tailing piles here and there, but if you were new to the town and drove around, you'd never notice that it was major. It was the industry, it was the primary industry, and everybody made their living in the mine and supporting the mine, particularly the Simpson mine. That's what this is in Lafayette, the image of. The railroad also is common to both communities and came through Louisville in the early 1870s, but the spur to Lafayette was built in about 1889 by John H. Simpson and the Simpson mine. This image shows where the spur left along Pine Street. There you can see kind of where it goes, and this would be Highway 42, and this is Pine Street. But the Colorado and Southern spur went to Lafayette, and that's how the coal got to Denver from Lafayette. And the railroad, it wasn't free to build it, of course, but the railroad put a surcharge in each car full of coal going to Denver, and that's how they were repaid. The railroad was repaid, so there was very little out of pocket for the coal company and the coal mine, the people who owned the mines in Lafayette. And again, there's no trace of this spur anywhere, this Colorado and Southern spur. The sugar beet era is shared as well between the two communities, and this was important because of Great Western Sugar and their efforts to recruit particularly Latinos, but there's hardly any newspaper you could pick up or any conversation you could have for 20 years in Lafayette that didn't involve sugar beets. The Wanekas grew them, and everybody worked the fields in the summertime when the miners weren't mining coal. Families worked the fields, the beet fields. The significant landmark in Lafayette at the time, around 1910, was the beet dump, this is about the 700 block of, this is Baseline Road, and the elevator now is right about here. And the beet dump, it was a large elevated platform, and the wagons drove up here and they dumped their beets into the railroad cars that were sitting along the siding here as well too. Lafayette never got a beet processing plant. Like there was a lot of talk of it, that they were going to put in something like Great Western Sugar, but that never occurred. But it was significant, and it was shared with the coal mines of the recruitment of the Latino families to work the mines and to work the sugar beet fields. 1906 was the power plant. This was unique to Lafayette, but this is where Louisville got its first electricity. This plant was among the first distributed power systems in the country. And that means until that time, these plants were ordinarily just dedicated to municipalities. And this was among the first to actually share power all the way up along the Front Range and into Wyoming. And that was unique. It was used full time until 1928 when the Valmont plant was built, and was torn down in the 50s or 60s. I don't remember the exact date. The other thing that's unique to Lafayette is the Lincoln Highway, which at conception, it was designed to be a motor highway from the West Coast to the East Coast. And for some reason, somebody got talked into making a leg from Wyoming into Denver, and Lafayette was part of that. And this was, keep in mind, this was pre-Highway 287. So it was essentially sections of unpaved roads. Some of it was paved, but most of it wasn't. But if you drive, there's hardly any trace of these back roads now, particularly when you get down into Erie here. This is all developments now, and this area as well too. But it, you know, that the way markings were relative to Longmont. 10-mile corner and 6-mile corner were all relative to Longmont, and 9-mile corner was relative to Boulder. And Lafayette, even though this segment was decertified in 1915, Lafayette still called Highway 287 Lincoln Highway, downtown Lafayette particularly. So the transcontinental link was unique to Lafayette as well too. The first transcontinental phone call between San Francisco and New York City came along these phone lines that came through Lafayette, and they were put in. I'm not sure the exact date that they were put in, and there are remnants of these poles on 111th, and very few of them left, but they've been chopped and shortened obviously as well too. But this was significant, and you know, I don't think it made any difference in the phone calls that Louisville and Lafayette citizens made, even to each other, but it was significant in that the world was developing and happening through a conduit that came through Lafayette. The other thing that the two communities share is the Ku Klux Klan in Lafayette. The Clavern was particularly strong in Lafayette, and targeted Catholics in Louisville primarily, and targeted Latinos and Catholics in Lafayette. And the Clavern in Lafayette was ordained or chartered in 1923 and died down in 1935, although there's evidence that they continued for several years after that as well too. But if you have a chance to look at the History of Colorado, they've digitized the Ku Klux Klan membership roll. There was a state level roll, a membership roll of every member of the Ku Klux Klan, and it's been digitized. It hasn't been indexed, but there are several Louisville residents in that. There are many Lafayette residents, but several. The Clavern here in Lafayette was estimated at 150, some people said at the time. I want to concentrate primarily tonight though on Mary Miller's War on Alcohol. And Lafayette was established in 1888 as a dry town, and it's unique in and shared with Greeley and Longmont, which both of those cities were established as dry towns. But as you can tell, the Greeley Tribune celebrated Lafayette being a dry town in 1892. It made big news in the Greeley Tribune. But I'm using the war analogy because at the national level, that's what was being discussed, that it was a war against the rum runners and the rum makers, and it's defined in those terms as a war. So how we know, I'm talking about Mary Miller, how we know what we know about Mary Miller. We don't have anything that she wrote, even personal correspondence. There's really nothing. So we really don't have anything that she wrote. She wasn't covered very much in the newspaper other than social calls, like Joe Jones visited Mary Miller for dinner on Friday, those sorts of things. Very sparse references to Mary Miller. There is, because of digital records coming online, a rich record of everything about her in digital documents. And if you want to do some digging on your own, you can find a lot about her as well too. But at the county level, the deeds, notes, contracts, liens, and mining claims particularly are all digitized, going back to when we were the Colorado Territory. Court filings, testimony, and judgment. She was involved in at least a half a dozen court cases that I can find. A lot of, at the time, those court cases ended up at the Colorado Supreme Court. For some reason, it was easy to do that. Those are not digitized. Those are in boxes at the Supreme Court records room. It's on 13th Street down in Denver. It's a little hard to get to. Coal company records are part of it. We were talking about the Rocky Mountain Fuel Company records at the Western History Museum at the Denver Public Library. About 50 boxes of records that also are not indexed, but those references are primarily to what Mary Miller owned and the relation that she had with the coal companies and the lawsuits that she had against the coal companies, because she did sue them. And obviously the records of what was due to her in terms of royalties. There are also ditch company minutes, and these are closely held. I had the good fortune of acquiring some Goodhue ditch company minutes about 6 months ago. And Mary Miller was the secretary, the recording secretary of one of the ditch companies. So we get a little bit of insight about her and how she handled meetings particularly. Also, the United Mine Workers of America, the local 1388 meeting minutes, the originals of those are in the Lafayette Public Library, and they are phenomenal. They detail page by page the long strike, which occurred 1913 to 1910, roughly to 1914. And it's worth spending a day just looking at those as well too. But they do reference Mary Miller in she was called upon to reopen a mine in order to help the miners who were on strike, the striking miners. The Congregational Church meeting minutes are in the Lafayette Public Library as well too, and those are really interesting. And Mary Miller doesn't record any of it, but she attends the meetings and as part of the board and helps. There were some disciplinary issues with one of the pastors that was at the church, and she was a mitigating factor in that, clearly. And then the Miller family descendants who I've had a chance, some of them I had a chance to talk to in primarily in separate lines from the Miller family, not descendant of Mary Miller herself. Oral histories are part of what's at the Lafayette Public Library as well too. And then finally, there's a lot of, in my opinion, locally, a lot of history that can only be explained by exclusion, and the conclusion that you can make can only be made by exclusion. And I'll give you an example of that when we get to it. So the Millers came from Iowa in about 1863, and they lived in Longmont, near Longmont, for 3 years, and then they bought the Rock Creek House Tavern, which is now the Stearns Dairy south of Lafayette. It's the Rock Creek open space. That's where the Rock Creek House Tavern was. It was a stage stop. And in Mary Miller's words, here a typical roadhouse was conducted, and this roadhouse has the same meaning today as it had back then. It was a place to stop to eat and drink. They also obtained a liquor license. It's in the Boulder County Commissioner's records in July of 1866. And then there are signs of that they were having serious trouble staying in business because they defaulted on a promissory note for the ranch and ended up selling the ranch and the tavern to Abner Goodhue, A.C. Goodhue. It's the Goodhue ditch, who formed the Goodhue ditch. They also owed back taxes as well too. So it was pretty clear that things were not going well for them at that tavern. This is from the Colorado Supreme Court records of the note that was the note that was made to James Foote by Thomas Lindsay, who sold the tavern. And it was $1,000 at 1.5%, and it wasn't paid back. So Thomas Lindsay sued James Foote particularly to get his money back, and he did eventually. In the 1870s, the Millers were split between Boulder and Lafayette, what would become Lafayette. The Miller children attended the school that was local at Willow Glen Schools at Highway 42 and 287. And the Miller farm, which is Lafayette now, was managed by Mary Miller, and Lafayette Miller, her husband, and he went by Leif Miller. That's how he's referred to in the newspaper. He built a butcher shop in Erie, and then James B. Foote, who was Mary Miller's brother. I should have made that connection for you too, but James Foote, Mary Foote Miller, James B. Foote is her brother. And Lafayette Miller and James Foote were in partnership in business. So they also opened a butcher shop in Boulder. And Lafayette and Mary had a house on Water Street, which is Cannon Street in Boulder. So they resided in both places, went between both towns. Lafayette Miller was fairly interesting. He died young, but he ran for Boulder mayor in 1878, lost by 4 votes, and then was elected an alderman in a special election later. This is kind of related to the default of the tavern as well too, and I'll explain why they're related. The newspaper said he put up a brick structure which was occupied by a wholesale liquor establishment. So here he was, after owning a saloon, he and James B. Foote they established a wholesale liquor store next to his butcher shop in Boulder. In the newspapers at the time, there's frequent reference to Leif Miller, to Lafayette Miller, regularly as being under the weather. And he died in 1878 at age 38. And described in his obituary, acute attack of Bright's disease coupled with derangement of the liver. And it's critical. The term derangement of the liver, if you do the research about medicine at the time, the primary attribute was overconsumption of alcohol. Derangement of the liver was, and their scientific methods were non-existent at the time. So it was in a journal, in a medical journal, was a doctor's opinions, but that's generally what you find, that his death was attributed to a liver malfunction, or I think it's cirrhosis of the liver. That's what I think it is. Mary Miller in the 1880s, so she's by herself raising her kids. To describe her, she's a Congregationalist and established the Congregational Church and paid for the pastor, built the church and paid for the pastor. She's a member of the Prohibition Party. She's a member of the International Order of Good Templars, which is a temperance organization, anti-alcohol. She led the Lafayette Law and Order League, also had to do with anti-saloon primarily, concerned with other things. They wanted law enforced too, but their primary concern was saloons and disorder at the saloons. And she was also a member of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. So this is, her influences at the time are pretty easy to ascertain, particularly the WCTU, the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Frances Willard, who was one of the co-founders, explains that the war against alcohol and the rum shops is a war between the rum shops and religion. We have a conflict, a war, a knife, and a knife to the hilt. Only one can win. The question is, which one is it going to be? Trying to motivate the members to their belief in temperance, and their belief was one of abstention, of abstaining from alcohol, versus prohibition, which is focused on the manufacture and supply of alcohol, stopping that. That's essentially what prohibition is. But the WCTU is also interested in women's suffrage, women's right to vote, child labor laws, and age of consent. age of consent laws. So they on the national level, and the local level, they were doing a lot of good things. Other influences for her, John B. Goff. If you ever have a chance to, his I think it's his autobiography, might be a biography that somebody else wrote, but anyway, it is online, and it's interesting to read about John B. Goff because he traveled the world trying to keep people from drinking and rallying the troops to do the same. To the end of society's ills was simply, there was one simple solution: it was getting rid of alcohol. The other ally, an influence for Mary Miller, was John B. Finch, who lived in Nebraska, based and lived in Nebraska, and traveled. We don't know if he came here. He probably came to Lafayette, and you can see that they both died about a year apart as well too, which is significant. So this is related to Louisville. Some Lafayette history that's related to Louisville. John H. Simpson, who was Louisville's first mayor, and with his brothers, he was a prospector and they were mine engineers, the family. And with his brothers, they built a mercantile, which was among Louisville's first businesses. And he, while he was mayor and shortly after, soured to Louisville's alcohol and to Louisville's saloons. And his entire family moved. They all moved. Some of them came to Lafayette. He moved to land which is now Centaurus. It's a land where Centaurus is now. And because of, and you can see the quote that was in the newspapers, we don't want Louisville Incorporated because it might be cleaned up, and whiskey would cost more. Oh my God, we don't want that. That was a quote in the newspaper. So that's kind of what he faced. And he didn't, John H. Simpson didn't want to stay in Louisville. He came to Lafayette. The other local allies of Mary Miller at the time, one was her son, Charles L. Miller, George Cannon, George Bermont, and Vandenberg. Bermont and Vandenberg were the operators of the mercantile in Lafayette. O.M. Hopkins, who was a local businessman, and then the anti-saloon newspaper at the time was the Lafayette News and Free Press. Her opponents in Lafayette were, believe it or not, her other son, George I. Miller, who was 1 year younger than Charles. And this is a completely interesting dynamic, and I hope to be able to explore it a little bit more, but kind of a weird thing, I think. The other interesting character at the time, who was a saloon owner and was in favor of serving drinks, was Sidney Pasco. This photo is one of the tokens that was accepted in his saloon. And C.C. Rosenbaum, who was a town alderman, he pops up as being in favor of issuing liquor licenses and is on the town board off and on. Charles Hake, if you're familiar with the Hakes, they helped establish Superior. So there's some outside influence in Lafayette establish saloons. And then the Lafayette Leader was the pro-saloon newspaper. And the primary reason too, and this is reflected in all of these opinions, the personal opinion was related to, if they can't get it here, they're going to get it somewhere else. If we don't want them spending their time in Denver, because it was easy to get to Denver by train, spending all their money and then coming back empty pocketed. So that was the primary reason. We got to serve it. We got to keep everyone who wants to drink beer here in town, here in Lafayette. First thing that Mary Miller did when she established Lafayette in 1888, she founded the town in 1888, was include on every lot, every deed for every lot that she sold, a liquor clause. And it essentially said that you could possess alcohol, you could have it in your house, but you couldn't sell it or give it away. And if you did so, if you sold it or gave it away, you lost your property. And there's, that I could find, only one instance of that happening. And believe it or not, it was Vermont and Vandenberg that it happened to. But it was on the deeds, property deeds for each property individually. And then as she started platting other parts of town, that clause was in platting documents. And if you're familiar with your own title history of your own property, if there's a deed restriction on the plat, that carries through to your lot, to your own property. So her intent with these was to target saloons and keep saloons out of town. This is a representation of how Lafayette looked when it was established, her establishing plat in 1888. This was in early 1888, February of 1888. And there are 8 streets that were named at the time. And you can see, if you follow how they go in pairs, John Goff, John Finch, 2 states, then 2 people, John B. Foote. John B. Foote was her dad, who came out with them from Iowa eventually and lived on the Miller farm. And then Simpson Street there's some historical narrative that it was named after the Simpson mine, but the Simpson mine wasn't even producing when she was thinking of street names and platting the street. The Simpson really didn't start producing coal until late 1888. So there was no Simpson mine. There was no guarantee that there was going to be any coal coming out of the Simpson mine. So that street is named for John H. Simpson. Geneseo Street is the city, and then Cleveland Street is, I think, the city of Cleveland. And the reason why is because the historical narrative says that it's Grover Cleveland, and I did my best to try to corroborate that indeed was the case. And you can see he was the president 2 separate terms from 1885 to 1897. There was a gap in his presidency. He was considered a Bourbon Democrat, and that is reference to the French Bourbons, the Bourbon family, the Bourbon. They're known for it's the laissez-faire method of governing, that whatever happens. That's a Bourbon philosophy. But you can imagine, so here's Mary Miller at Sunday tea, and they say, well, you named your street after Grover Cleveland. And yeah, and I said, well, why'd you do that? He's a Bourbon Democrat and he likes bourbon. I mean, there's no way that she would want to spend the time explaining what Bourbon Democrat meant and that it wasn't related to alcohol. But also, he sided with the Democrat Party in its opposition to temperance. So he didn't want to have anything to do with what she was interested in. So that's my point about exclusion in history and finding things in history, that there is no way that street was named after Grover Cleveland. That's why I think it was probably named after Cleveland, Ohio, which is where the WCTU was formed. This is a map from 1888, and this is from the Carnegie Library. But the interesting part of it, if you can see, next to Lafayette, somebody established the town of East Louisville. And it was established, East Louisville was established as a place to serve alcohol adjacent to Old Town Lafayette. And it was done at the same time that Mary Miller established her. This is a map from 1888. So it was done at the same time that Mary Miller was platting her town, and a direct response to that. And this comprises, East Louisville comprises the 100 blocks of North and South Public Road on the west side. And the first liquor license was issued in East Louisville in 1890, and it had 7 saloons by 1905. But you can see, here's a newspaper article about George I. Miller, her son. He went into Boulder to tell everybody that he was establishing a wet town in defiance of his mother, clearly in defiance of his mother. It was later platted, and these are the people who platted West Lafayette. East Louisville was changed to West Lafayette in 1898 and made a part of Lafayette. And the same allies that are listed there, her son, Charles Hake, Frank Weisenhorn. And usually in the plats to that time, this is where the liquor clause would be. It's a little hard to read, I know, on your screen. And this is the 100 block of North Public, 100 block of South Public. And there's a few lots here that are adjacent, starting in the 200 block, but west side of Public Road. And this is 1900. This is a map from 1900. So this shows, this is west now looking this downside is west. And you can see the saloons that were established in that confined 2 blocks. And I was thinking to myself, drawing the comparison to how Louisville developed in downtown Louisville, and the numerous saloons that were really on Front Street primarily, but also on Main Street. And that kind of defined the burgeoning mercantile district, where as the saloons in Lafayette, everything was on East Simpson Street, and these saloons were out on their own on the west side of Public Road. It was called County Road back then. That's why it says County Road. But so here's kind of an outline of the battlefield at the time. The dry side of Lafayette that Mary Miller established, the east side of Public Road. Public Road, it's kind of hard to see, but it splits it here. Starting in 1888 was the dry side. Here's East Louisville, changed to West Lafayette, the roughly a little over 2 blocks, 2 square blocks, where the saloons were, where you could sell and distribute, you could give away and sell alcohol. So all of the friends decided they would get together and kind of do their best to encapsulate the west side of town. This is Hopkins. This is the Hopkins edition. All of these plats, these additions to Lafayette happened between 1904 and 1907. So the Hopkins was part of that. This is Miller's first edition. This was done with their other son, Charles. They also did this one, Miller's second edition. And then Beaumont and Vandenberg stepped in and took over and did this part of West Lafayette. And then they also finished off the Mountain View edition as that. So there was a concerted effort over 2 or 3 years to make sure that if there were going to be saloons, that it was only going to be where they were at the time, and they weren't going to be anywhere else in town. This is one of the few photos that we do have of a saloon in Lafayette. This is the North Star Saloon. And for some reason, the mayor of Lafayette, Swan Edison, I don't know whether he was pro-saloon or anti-saloon. I'm not familiar enough with him, but he's in an outing, a buggy outing, and he's in front of the saloon getting his picture taken. So I thought that was kind of interesting. But that is really, we don't have any photos of the saloons particularly. But here's Sidney Pasco, who the saloons were getting out of control in Mary Miller and the Law and Order League's opinion. So they put together a petition. 300 people signed a petition saying, county sheriff, you need to, and the town board, you need to enforce the liquor laws. And if people are going to drink in the saloons, they need to stay in the saloons, essentially what they were saying. But well, Sidney Pasco got a hold of the petition, and he actually, with the 300 signatures, and there was no way to make copies back then. So he had the original petition and he hung it in his saloon so everybody in town could see who the anti-saloon people were. And this is one of the few occasions that Mary Miller responds in full in the newspaper to something that was happening in her community. And she didn't like it, of course. So let's talk about prohibition a little bit too. Largely an anti-immigrant initiative with evidence of commingling of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Ku Klux Klan, and the Anti-Saloon League. Colorado Prohibition was enacted in 1916, nationwide in 1920, and then it was repealed in 1933. And I have this, the cover of this book, which is a really good book to understand the really the racial and the racist aspects of prohibition, and in anti-immigrant particularly manifestations. But this is Lisa McGurr, who's a professor at Harvard, and it's a really good book. It's worth reading and understanding. You better understand it's a better understanding of how religion was significant and important in prohibition and the prohibition movement, and then led to the rise of the KKK. Really, that's the point of the book, that they were interrelated, and one begat the other. So the other question that I get asked quite a bit from people who read the book and people I talk about Mary Miller is, she was a wealthy woman at one time, and she got coal royalties from the leases on her land, and bought and sold a lot of property, was in business, established 2 banks, established a mill. She did a lot of things. She did a lot of things for her community, but there's really no trace of there's no remaining trace of her wealth, or after kind of, I mean, usually she's not going to make a monument of herself, but you would think there would be like a Miller building, and there was a Miller Bank, I guess, at one time too. But so I kind of chronicled the Miller Ranch Tavern bailout in 1870. That was clearly due to her husband Lafayette and her brother not being good business people, and she had to help. They had to sell the tavern in order to bail out that business. The failed liquor distributorship, and this is even in James B. Foote's obituary, that, as I say on down, he died penniless because of a failed liquor distributorship. She, in all of the records that I've been able to look at, didn't have a lot of partnerships with her brother, with James B., and instead partnered with his wife, Harriet Hattie Foote, particularly when it came to coal company negotiations and coal royalty lease negotiations. So she, you know, there was a problem with her brother. There was a problem with her husband. They weren't good managers, and the point that I make in the book is that they were probably drinking the profits, and they were you know, there's a reason she had the view about temperance that she had, and it had to do with her husband and her brother. And then the Miller Bank failure too, which didn't get a lot of attention, but it's a mystery of what happened to $60,000 or $90,000. We're not quite sure how much money it was, but it's enough money that the bank failed. The bank went out of business. And the narrative, the historical narrative, is one of, well, it was a simple misunderstanding that the union, they were paying stipends to the striking miners during the coal strike, and the bank overextended themselves, and the UMWA main office didn't give the money in time to cover those stipends, and that doesn't make sense, because if it was a simple misunderstanding of the bank failure, the bank would have opened up. It would have been back in business, and there is in oral histories a suggestion that one of her sons, took off with the money and went to Texas. We don't know for sure, but it's an example of that she had money, and she tried to help folks in her family prosper, and it didn't quite work out that way. And here I want to leave this talk with this correspondence this is to James B. Foote, who's Mary Miller's brother. And in 1886. This was in the records of the ditch company, and it's kind of astounding. It leads off, it leads off cordially, friend foot, but then it goes into, you had better have a note on the books of the company that your share in said ditch is held by John Nicholson. Well, Mary Miller was the secretary of this ditch company, along with the president of it was A.C. Goodhue. And here's yet another example of her having to bail her brother out. And the terms of this correspondence were, you had better have, which you never see. You never see anything that threatening. Everything's always cordial. And so I thought that was, this is indicative of a good-natured woman and a good-hearted woman, and trying her best to, like I said, to help her family. And her husband was not a good businessman, and her brother was not a good businessman. So that concludes my talk. I'm happy to answer questions, and you can order the book online. The publisher has promised me that the Lafayette Miners Museum is going to have copies, and Jack's and Walgreens will as well too. And then some of the references, digital references I source for this slide, particularly the Western History Museum digital collection in Denver is a really, really good resource. So anyway, I'll stop the share, and then we'll start on questions, I guess.
Sounds good, Doug. Just a reminder to everyone who is with us still, if you have a question, please type it into the chat where everyone can see it, or you can send it directly to me and I can read it out loud. Or additionally, you can hit the raise hand function on your screen and I will allow you to use your microphone so that you can voice your question or comment. So it looks like we have one question starting us off. Lauren wants to know, what did Mary Miller do after the bank failure?
Hi, Lauren. How are you? Good to hear from you. She died in 1921, and I didn't make note of that during the slideshow, but she did live to see prohibition in the state of Colorado and nationwide in 1920, and then she died in 1921. She, by most historical accounts, she was infirm for several years, for 2 to 3 years, leading up to her death in 1921. So really, after, I think kind of that was the final straw of that failure, the bank failure and the disgrace of the failure. She was reclusive and became even more so after that as well too. But yeah, the astounding thing is that she's faded away. Everyone in the family has faded away. There's really, really very few descendants who are connected to Lafayette anymore.
Thank you, Doug. We have several more questions coming in. Lee would like for you to say more about the connection between temperance and the KKK, specifically in this area, so Louisville, Lafayette.
Sure. So temperance is, there's a religious aspect to temperance clearly as well too, fundamental and largely sourced through the Methodist Church. And in the circles of the KKK, all of the members of the KKK that we know of were also members of the Methodist Church. But East Boulder County was particularly ripe for anti-immigrant and sort of racist viewpoints of white supremacy, and particularly the early fundamentalist Christian circuits that came and lectured in town as well too, starting in the late 1890s. So it was, it was a state of mind of purity and of righteousness and anti-immigrant and anti-immigration, and that carried through to the Women's Christian Temperance Union and to the Anti-Saloon League particularly. But the rise of the KKK was an enforcement arm of temperance, and it can be viewed, I think, the people who were raiding the illegal stills at the Columbine mine were KKK members from Lafayette. There was the sheriff and the county sheriff particularly, but yeah, so there's a clear progression of temperance begetting the KKK.
Thanks, Doug. Just to follow back up, we've got 2 additional questions that kind of hit on that. One would like to know how organized or connected the temperance efforts were between Colorado and Kansas, and additionally, which immigrant groups were the primary targets in our area.
Well, the connectedness of Kansas, we don't know for sure. We do know that there was a newspaper published in Boulder called the Rocky Mountain American that chronicled, it had a local correspondent in Lafayette, and for 6 or 9 months talked about how great it was to be in the Ku Klux Klan in Lafayette. And it's at some point they figured out that all the people that they were mentioning in these articles, they were being mentioned for a reason. They were in the KKK, and they probably ought to not do that. So they ended up pulling the plug on the publication. The correspondent stopped corresponding as well too. But the biggest connection was because every level of the state was influenced by the KKK and controlled by the KKK. That filtered through to places by Lafayette. But so Catholics and Latinos in Lafayette both were immigrant Latinos who were viewed, even though they were here for generations, in Colorado for generations, were viewed as being from Mexico and categorized as that, and intimidated as that as well too. And there was obviously too crossover between most Latinos at the time were part of the Catholic Church as well too. So they were exceptional targets.
And Doug, is this just a Western phenomenon, or have you seen examples of the KKK being connected to the temperance movement nationwide?
Well, like I said, I recommend reading the book "The War on Alcohol," which does explain it at the national level, particularly of all the state leaders who were leaders of the Temperance Union, but also leaders of the KKK. And there are a lot of references to Colorado in terms of the strong arm of, once temperance was enacted through the 18th Amendment, the strong arm of the enforcement was the KKK themselves. And they were busy trying to stop alcohol, but they were also trying to keep Lafayette white as well in that process.
Thank you, Doug. To switch gears, got 2 questions. Did Mary ever remarry? And is that her picture on the side of the Lafayette Library? One of our listeners wants to know.
It is, yeah. That's a mosaic of her in Lafayette. The mural is, and she never did remarry. And we don't really know why, or I think she had a mission to keep the saloons out of town. It was kind of primarily focused on that.
Gotcha. Also, one participant would like to know which son is thought to have taken off to Texas with the bank's money.
James P. Miller was, and this is one of the great grandsons who alleges that. And James Miller was, I don't know about that he was an attorney here in town for a long time, but he was also one of the bank officers as well too in 1915. So yeah, it may have happened. We don't know for sure, but there's, like I said, there's a reason that the bank closed, and it's not clear. It's never been made public, but it wasn't a misunderstanding for sure.
Okay, and someone is also asking if there is a link to view your slides after this program. I will say that we are recording it and it will be up on the Louisville Historical Museum's YouTube channel shortly. But Doug, will there be a link to your slides that we can send to participants?
Sure. Well, yeah, we'll figure that out. I'll make sure.
Great. Thank you so much for that question. That's the last one that I caught. If you have any additional questions, please type them in the chat or feel free to raise your hand, and we'll wait for just a few minutes. Okay, someone is asking, what is the oldest building still standing in Lafayette? And where is Mary Millard buried?
Mary Miller is at the Columbia Cemetery, which is on the hill there in Boulder. She's buried. Lafayette Miller was buried on the Miller farm and was disinterred and moved to the Columbia Cemetery. So they're both over in Boulder now, buried in Boulder, and that's where the Foots are, where James B. Foote is as well, and Hattie Foote. And the oldest structure that we know of, is the granary, the Wanaka granary that's near Wanaka Reservoir. It's on the southeast corner of Wanaka Reservoir, and there was disagreement between Chuck Wanaka and his brother Clancy Wanaka as whether it was actually the Wanaka granary, whether it belonged to the Wanakas. Chuck didn't think it did. He thought it belonged to the Harmons, but nonetheless, it's a very old building, a very old structure. Before 1860, around 1860, we think.
And we just have a comment, someone saying they missed the Louisville Times, as a nod to your family, Doug.
Thank you. Thank you.
And an additional comment, not a question, but one of our participants is thanking you for clarifying why my West Side house deed says I can't sell or give away alcohol. She says, I had heard that the West Side was wet, so I appreciate the map of the west and dry area, or the wet and dry areas, excuse me. So I'm not seeing any additional questions. Like I said, we will be putting the recording of this talk up on our YouTube channel, and we'll email a link to everyone who registered. We've got some people thanking you, Doug, in the comments.
Oh, thank you
so much for doing such a great job. It's very
thanks.
interesting.
Thanks, everybody.
Just waiting to see if there's any last minute questions. Nobody wants to raise their hand. Well, I'm not seeing any last minute questions. So thank you so much, Doug. And
Sure.
I'm not sure if any of the other panelists need to close out, but thank you so much. And everyone is just thanking you in the comments for a job well done.
All right, cool. Thank you, everybody.
I was just going to say real quick too that shameless plug, but your book is available at the Miners Museum for sale. So if you want to purchase Doug's book and also make a donation in the same process to local history, the museum would be a great place to stop by and grab your copy.